Bonjour à tous, bienvenue à cette conférence de presse de Stavros LAMBRINIDIS, qui est rapporteur du Parlement sur la sécurité et les droits fondamentaux sur Internet. Un rapport d'initiative qui avait été adopté il y a quelques semaines à l'unanimité par la Commission des libertés civiles et qui sera examiné demain en plénière à midi. Je vais donc laisser la parole à notre rapporteur. You have the floor, Mr. LAMBRINIDIS.
Dear friends, I'm very pleased by the attention that my report has received in the past few weeks, especially in the internet world, as it obviously addresses it. I will give you a very brief presentation of the key points of this report. I think that its importance, whatever that may be, will be judged by you and by the users and the citizens, not by me. We live in a world where everyone, from governments to private companies to even criminals, attempt to have the greatest possible access to our personal data and our personal life. Now, this is a direct result of the Internet. And this is, in fact, the schizophrenia in some ways that the Internet entails. On the one hand, it is the instrument that gives an opportunity to expand beyond any previous notion the exercise of our fundamental rights, the right to free speech, the right to associate with other people and discuss ideas, the right to engage in collective action, the freedom of the press to disseminate and collect information and ideas around the world, the right to education. At the same time, of course, because of its nature, all these rights can be endangered in the Internet, because technology allows such easy access to all our private data. It could chill political speech if people feel that by talking in a particular web forum, they may be followed and cast for their ideas and beliefs and political opinions. In that sense, it is extremely important now, as the Internet is becoming from cyberspace, in other words, a space that somehow is outside our real world, into our real space, at an age where millions of people, in a few years, hundreds of millions of people will be conducting their business through the Internet, it's extremely important that now we focus on these serious dilemmas. How do we propose to promote security in the Internet, fight crime, allow business activities to develop in a beneficial way for all, and at the same time ensure that we protect fundamental rights? This is the big question that my report addresses. Let me, in brief titles, tell you a few things that the Civil Liberties Committee unanimously a month ago adopted and is proposing now to plenary for adoption. First of all, we ask for Europe and for the European Council to be in the forefront of the development of an Internet Bill of Rights around the world. The Internet knows no boundaries, and therefore the protection of fundamental rights on the Internet should know no boundaries. Today, these efforts have begun. Europe participates. It's extremely important that it takes an active, an even more active role, a leading role worldwide and Europe-wide in this regard. Second, we emphasize the extreme importance of fighting crimes, old crimes and new crimes in the Internet, while ensuring at the same time that the constant surveillance of all users, suspect or not, for crimes should not be allowed in a democratic society. This extremely important principle must be guarded because it is so easy to violate it given the technology of today. Let me give you a very simple example. No one would accept in our democratic societies for a government to open every letter that we send through the post office in order for it to check the words and the sentences that we write. no one would allow a private company to open every letter we send through the post office, to check what we write, so then they can send us back at our home addresses advertisements that they guess might be of interest to us according to what we wrote in a very private correspondence. And yet, both governments and private companies today have the technology, and some actually apply it, to do exactly that, the systematic surveillance of every user's emails, which are, of course, the electronic form of a letter. What I propose is that we should ensure that fighting crime is extremely important in the Internet and should be pursued, and we should support its pursuit by police and by governments in the exact same way, with the exact same vigilance, but also with the exact same limits that we impose upon governments and police and private companies to do so in the non-Internet world. This principle that may sound self-evident to many, it certainly sounded to everyone in the Civil Liberties Committee, is not to all. There are people who wish to use the technology in order to violate it. A third principle discussed in the report is the right of citizens to have access to the Internet. Dear friends, today, if you like, the new illiteracy of the 21st century will be e-illiteracy, will be not knowing how to use a computer and not having access to the Internet, in the exact same way that in the 20th century, illiteracy was not being able to access a school. The report emphasizes the responsibility of governments to ensure that even the poorest people and the remotest regions have access to computers and to the Internet. It also emphasizes the importance of not denying access to the Internet for punitive purposes to people. There are many, many ways in which someone can be punished for misdeeds or crimes they commit. But to say or to target as a first measure cutting off Internet access would be equivalent in many ways to targeting as a first measure cutting off school access. The report also focuses and emphasizes the extreme importance of discussing limits that should be placed on consent of users, whether or not limits on what a company or a government may ask a user to consent to in terms of giving away some of his or her fundamental rights for return to a service, but also limits to what a user may unilaterally, voluntarily consent away on his or her fundamental rights. The second part may sound to many who are listening to this a little bizarre. You might say, well, if my fundamental rights, if my privacy belongs to me, shouldn't I have the right to abandon it at any moment if I so desire? Well, the answer to this complicated question can be gleaned perhaps, or can be made simpler if one looks at a related field that we all know about, which is labor rights and labor consent. Even though a worker may have the right to consent to working 24 hours a day if an employer asks him to, even if a worker may have the right to consent not to have a lunch break or never to go to the bathroom while he or she is working, our labor laws deny governments or companies the right to ask for that consent. And the reason is that our laws recognize that an employer and an employee are in a very different position, power-wise and knowledge-wise, for any consent in that level to be a truly freely given one. Similarly, the report argues, big internet companies and private citizens are in a very different position of power and knowledge. And therefore, it's extremely important for us today to consider how much of our freedom can be consented away in such transactions. Dear friends, Big Brother in Europe today will not come because some authoritarian regime imposes it upon us. It will come, if it ever does, with our consent. And indeed, one sees in the past few years this trend developing. After September 11th, and under the fear of terrorism, which is very, very tangible, you can see a picture of a terrorist, you cannot see a picture of an email going from one place to the other. Much easier to target a terrorist in people's minds. After September 11th, there has been a tendency of governments and of the European Commission and Council to take measures under fear, which is always a very, very bad judge when one takes measures that affect fundamental rights. And these measures, little by little, infringe upon privacy and fundamental rights, each one a little more than the previous one. You get used to the first, you agree to a second. You get used to a second, you agree to a third. And one day you may wake up with a camera in every room of every house simply because technology will allow for tiny cameras to exist. And you may wonder, how did this happen? Did I say yes? The answer is that you did. So here we are in this very difficult dilemma, and the answer that this report tries to give is fight crime with all our might within the law. Never violate fundamental rights unless it is proven to be necessary, appropriate for the crime being fought, and proportionate in a democratic society. Respect and promote the Internet to everyone around the world, because it is the new school and the new political arena of the 21st century. Do not chill political speech of people through the fear that they may be followed all their time, or their ideas may be followed. Do not allow for people to consent to things that they very often have no idea exist, or very rarely have the ability to truly say no to. Try to find a balance, and let's move into this wonderful and wondrous new world with the same safeguards for security and privacy that we have in the world that is outside the electronic era. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stavros Lambrinidis. We now have time for questions. Any questions? Oui, monsieur.
Κύριε Λαμπρινίδη, ήθελα να σας ρωτήσω το εξής. Γράφατε στην έκθεσή σας ότι οι κυβερνήσεις ή ιδιωτικές εταιρείες δεν θα πρέπει να στερούν εκδικητικά την πρόσβαση στο ίντερνετ για τους πολίτες. Είχαμε κάποια περιστατικά στην Ελλάδα τελευταία, αναγράφοντας τον τύπο, για εταιρείες που περιορίζουν την πρόσβαση στο ίντερνετ, στο Facebook, σε δίκτυα κοινωνικής δικτύωσης. Αυτό είναι κάτι το οποίο περιλαμβάνεται στις δικές σας τις παρατηρήσεις. Έχετε κάποιο σχόλιο πάνω σε αυτό?
Κοιτάξτε, let me answer in English in this. What my report says is that, and it doesn't refer to any particular crime, it refers in general, that access to the internet should not be punitively denied by private companies or by governments. And this is a very, very clear statement. No private company has the right to do this, certainly, because you mentioned a number of them. We do have laws in our countries, and of course there are circumstances under which a law may determine that as a last measure, not a private company, but a judicial authority may look into a number of punishments. That is something that democracies allow. But the instinct that exists today in some companies and governments to consider as a punitive measure cutting off internet access to people is, in my view, equivalent to an instinct that would have existed in previous centuries to, as a first measure, cut off schooling to people or access to a means for political expression to people. I think that it's a very serious business, and what my report is trying to do is to draw the right balance but also draw some lines in the sand, if you like, in order to raise awareness in the fact that the Internet is such a field of fundamental right promotion that cutting it off could be, on the contrary, a fundamental rights violation on many different levels, and that therefore that should not be something to be done lightly.
Thank you. More questions?
This gentleman there, I think.
Yes.
There are laws today that give, for example, record companies the right to ask internet companies for the IP numbers of their clients if they download music, for example, and they can then sue these people in a civil court. Do you address that kind of laws in your report, and what do you think about that?
No, my report doesn't address that specifically because it is not an intellectual property rights report. Now, there are intellectual property rights reports coming down the pipeline, and many serious issues will be discussed in that context. The European Commission, however, I remind you, has answered repeatedly, I believe, in questions filed by members of Parliament, that any such decisions should not be made by private companies in terms of giving up such data or taking punitive measures, but if taken at all, should be taken by government bodies. Your question focused on an inter-private company, if you like, enforcement procedure. I think that the European Commission, I can assure you, has stated this is under any circumstances not there. I have to say, by the way, that my report, although adopted unanimously in the Civil Liberties Committee, was asked by some MEPs to open up to amendments in plenary, amendments that appear to be focusing on intellectual property issues. I think it is unfortunate that apparently some intellectual property advocates have decided to target a report that has nothing to do specifically with intellectual property, when there are so many other reports that address this issue that are coming down the pipeline. I am sorry to see that eagerness on behalf of some people to take such a serious matter as a promotion of security and fundamental rights of the Internet in general, and to try to limit it for personal purposes, it would seem to me, to something that it is not. As far as intellectual property, anyone who reads the report will note that unanimously the Civil Liberties Committee approved a number of paragraphs in this report that ask for strong European laws to protect intellectual property in the Internet. That is in. And so I would hope that in spite of that diversion, the unfortunate diversion, as I said before, that the importance of the principles stated in this report affecting the whole of Internet, and the principles that the Civil Liberties Committee adopted unanimously will be the focus of debate and discussion, and not the particular interests of one person or the other person.
Merci. Y a-t-il d'autres questions? Ça n'a pas l'air d'être le cas. Alors, bon après-midi à tous. Merci.
Thank you very much.